This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Happy New Year, and welcome to this special edition of NC Spin. Even though the clock has started on a new year, we want to take one last look back at the events of 2016, the people we talked about, and we're going to name our NC Spin Tar Heel of the Year. So let's introduce this week's panel. They include Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, Becki Gray from the John Locke Foundation, political consultant Brad Crone, and syndicated columnist and author John Hood. Well, let's review last year's top stories, not necessarily in their order of importance, but we'll begin with the elections, which probably was the top story of next year. We held primary elections in March, June, and the general elections in November. It was early December before we finally learned the winners of two statewide races. We moved the primaries from May to March so as to have a larger voice in the selection of presidential outcomes. I want to ask to begin with John, how well did this work? Did we play a role in the nomination process?
I suppose, but it probably would not have mattered much if we'd had our primary in May. I think that the presidential race on the Republican side would have played out the same way as well as on the Democratic side. We've
had a good while now to sit back and reflect on these elections, Chris. What would you say was the overwhelming theme of the 2016 elections?
Well, I think it was change and unease, and I think if not for the election of Roy Cooper and Josh Stein, you would have considered a big Republican wave election, which is why I think their elections really stand out, in addition to the North Carolina Supreme Court, which I think was an unusual case on its own. But a big Republican year, people were unhappy. Remember, the vast majority of cases when a party has held the presidency for 2 terms, the voters want another party to hold the presidency. That's true nationally. It was true in North Carolina. So it was a change election, and some of that may have actually contributed to Pat McCrory's loss, although I think there were other factors.
Why did Roy Cooper win for governor and Josh Stein for AG, Becki?
You know, that's a good question, and don't forget that Roy Cooper barely won. I mean, you know, as you mentioned in the introduction, we didn't know until mid-December, and, you know, barely under that 10,000 vote margin. I really don't, I can't answer that. I think that Governor McCrory had some problems. I think that HB 2 contributed to it. I think that the I-77 toll contributed to it. I think that the film credits in Wilmington, the commercial fishermen versus the residential fishermen had a factor in it. Lots of things.
Brad, final takeaway on the elections.
Go back to the pitchfork. There's an ongoing battle in the Republican Party between your Chamber of Commerce wing and your pitchfork wing. Trump transformed the Republican Party from a conservative party to a party on national populism. And North Carolina continues to be a purple state. We're going to be very competitive.
Another big issue we talked about throughout the course of the year was the legislature. In addition to the short session, there were 4 special sessions of the legislature this year. The first in March passed HB 2. The second dealt with Hurricane Matthew and wildfire disasters. The third with legislation that reconfigured boards and stripped power from the governor's office. And the fourth, the week before Christmas, supposedly was going to repeal HB 2, but it didn't. I want to ask, Brad, how would you evaluate the work of our legislature this year?
D-. I mean, really, the Republicans have governed more from a philosophical and partisan standpoint than really looking at the goodwill and what needs to be done for the people of North Carolina, and that's a sad state and a sad commentary on our state.
John, what's your takeaway of the short session that we had this year?
Well, that session was, I think, fairly successful. The budget was in fairly good shape. They made some changes. They made some other substantive reforms that built on previous reforms. When they meet in regular sessions, they tend to make decisions and their caucuses are more organized than in these special sessions that were harder to manage. Of course, in the special sessions, except for the repeal of HB 2 session, they did push through pretty much what they wanted to.
Chris, have you ever seen a year in which the legislature itself was so much in the news?
No, but I think the legislature is exercising its power. They are the most powerful branch of government still. And I think going back to the loss of Governor McCrory, I think part of it was people wanted to check on the legislature. They might agree with some of the things the General Assembly's done, but I think the fact that Governor McCrory is not able to exercise his power as governor over his own party was a big factor. And one other point, this late in the year, the North Carolina Supreme Court, or the courts, overturned a decision by the legislature to take over the Asheville water system or to interfere. It was another in a long string of court decisions that went against the General Assembly, even with Republican judges making the decisions.
All right, Becki, okay, so we had the session to try to repeal HB 2, which didn't work. We had the special sessions with Senate Bill 4 and HB 17 regarding various powers of agencies and people in North Carolina. The polls have shown the legislature's popularity ratings are not real great. After these special sessions, how do the people of North Carolina view our legislature?
I don't know. I mean, we'll see. And of course, we're anticipating that there may very well be another legislative election in November of 2017. So I guess we'll see. I mean, it's also fresh at this point in time. I think we're still kind of recovering from the holidays, looking back at the repercussions of some of these special sessions. But talking of special sessions, don't forget, they also allocated over $200 million for flood and fire victims.
All right. Another big topic that we talked about were court decisions, which played a big role in the affairs of state this past year. Let's talk about some of the more controversial ones. The election reforms, voter ID, early voting, courts played a very active role in those, Brad.
They really did. They sent a message to the legislature that it's better to slow down and perhaps listen to your attorneys. Same thing on congressional redistricting and same thing on state legislative redistricting. So, you know, I just think the legislature so often is out of step with the mainstream of North Carolina.
Well, let's talk about the redistricting, Becki, because we had both court cases and decisions on the congressional side causing the legislature to come back in and reconfigure the congressional districts, as well as on the legislative side, as you just said a few minutes ago, ordering them to do that and have legislative elections next year.
Well, of course, that's on appeal, and so, you know, we'll see what happens on that. But what I'm hearing, what I'm getting a sense of is just in case the General Assembly is planning to move forward with that. So the way the court order reads right now, they'll have to have those new maps drawn in March with primaries in the late summer and then an election. So there's not a lot of time to sit around and waste on this.
Two other court cases, John. One was the separation of powers that Governor McCrory took the legislature to court, joined by former Governors Martin and Hunt. How big a decision was this?
I actually think that the stakes there appeared to be small. They were about a particular commission that governed coal ash, but actually the stakes more generally had to do with the separation of powers. Can the legislature encroach on what should be executive branch responsibilities? The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. There are some not exactly bright red lines, but there are some indicators that suggest when you're going too far. And I think that case will have repercussions.
Chris, the other issue was judicial retention. The court essentially said you cannot have just an election for a Supreme Court justice with no opponent to retain them.
Right, and remember, this was thrown out by a North Carolina three-judge panel appointed by the Chief Justice, and then the Supreme Court deadlocked when Justice Edmonds, who was up for re-election or in the retention election, recused himself. As it turned out, the court found that was unconstitutional, and then Justice Edmonds was defeated in the fall. That move about to have the retention election seemed purely a partisan way to keep control of the court, which Republicans lost.
Yes. We thank you for watching NC Spin all during the past year, over the air or on YouTube. Our New Year's pledge to you is to provide you with even more balanced debate in 2017. You can also find much more on our website, ncspin.com, or NCSpin on Facebook, video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and my weekly column. Happy New Year from all of us at NC Spin. We continue our rundown of the top stories of the past year after these messages.
The slogan on our family farm is growing the next generation. It means using innovative technology to conserve water and increase yields. It embodies our passion for providing food and fiber for our neighbors near and far. It represents our desire to take care of our employees, our land, and to leave a better place for our children. Farm life isn't easy, but it's a good life, and I love what I do.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
We continue our rundown of the top stories of 2017. North Carolina's economy was hurt more than most states by the recession of 2008. Recovery was slow in coming, but this year our state showed some positive signs of strength with more jobs created and a slight increase in wages. John Hood, what would you say your assessment of our state's economy was at year's end?
It was pretty good compared to the national average. We actually had a bit stronger performance in some of the metrics in 2015 than in 2016, but still comparatively good. In fact, there are only a handful of states in America that have higher than average job growth, higher than average income growth, higher than average GDP growth. North Carolina is one of those small number of states. So still one of the higher performing states in the country, but the whole nation's economy, while recovering still from the Great Recession, that rate of recovery has been historically weak.
What would you say, Brad, are the bright spots in this economy?
Well, clearly what we're seeing is the continued growth of the metropolitan regions, predominantly the Charlotte market and the Raleigh-Durham Fayetteville market. And that raises, it's a bright spot because you're getting a lot of technology, you're getting a lot of growth there in the healthcare sectors, but it also raises the question, what do we do about rural North Carolina?
Economic development and job development, Becki, was obviously something that was a major effort. We didn't hear as many big stories of economic development landing what they call the elephants this past year, but there were a number of announcements as far as mid-sized plants that were either expanding or moving in.
Right, and don't forget that most jobs are created with small businesses. I mean, that's the real economic engine of the state, and we saw that coming out of the governor's office. It seemed like every week, a couple times a week, he was announcing another 200 jobs, 150 jobs, those kind of things. And, you know, North Carolina's economy is recovering. As John said, it's recovering faster and stronger than our neighbors and the nation as a whole. We're doing quite well.
Well, a quick thing about that, there were also a lot of layoffs this year. If you keep up with the layoffs, a lot of plants were still closing, a lot of companies were moving as new ones moving in. But what's interesting, we had an election where Donald Trump came to North Carolina, and at rally after rally in rural North Carolina was talking about how bad things were. Governor McCrory was talking about how good things were in North Carolina. Donald Trump was tapping into the real anxiety in the rural parts of the state that Brad was talking about, which made it a fascinating economic message.
There were some trouble spots if you look beyond this. The I-85 corridor, as you've talked about, has been doing very, very well, but rural sections of North Carolina have not kept up with the pace of the economic growth. There were job sectors. A lot of the jobs that were being created came in the hospitality and leisure industries and were not high-paying manufacturing jobs and so forth. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is fair to say, Tom, that the rural areas were not prospering at the same rate as the urban areas. I just happened to cross a history book of North Carolina from 1931 in which they observed that rural areas were not growing as rapidly as urban areas, and it was a significant problem that North Carolina needed to solve. There's nothing new about this.
Well, it's also just not North Carolina. I mean, other states have the same urban-rural divide.
Another big topic we talked about quite a bit, particularly during the early part of the year and the spring of the year, was the Connect NC bond campaign, Brad, which I know that you helped in passing. $2 billion in public infrastructure bond packages aimed largely at building and repairing facilities at our universities and community colleges, as well as other public facilities. This was the first public bond campaign that North Carolina voters had the opportunity to approve in many years.
Since 2000, and it will be the hallmark measure for Pat McCrory's governorship. It will be the bright star because of the impact that it will have not only now from an economic boost, but the long term for the next 2-3 generations within our universities, community colleges, and communities in our state parks.
At year's end, there was, during the course of the year, there was some talk about perhaps maybe being able to put a transportation bond package together. It was talked about in the short session, Becki, but it never happened.
No, it didn't, but that's one of the things that Roy Cooper has talked about a transportation bond. And there was an appetite to look at it at least. I think that the success of this North Carolina Connect bond may bode well for another bond. But
so when are we going to see the effects
of
this $2 billion that's being spent
well,
on jobs created?
I think we're seeing them now. I mean, I think as those projects become led, I do think the transportation bond is an interesting topic. Governor McCrory said it again before he left office. I mean, I think he reminded lawmakers of it. I think there'll be some bipartisan support, although I think it'll be a tough sled in the legislature.
Another big topic that came up in October of this past year was Hurricane Matthew. The weather forecasters had been telling us for many days the fact that this storm was off the coast. It was moving up the east coast of North Carolina. When it finally arrived in our state, it was a Cat 1 storm, or a Category 1 storm. Didn't cause a lot of direct impact and damage in the coastal area, which is typically the way our hurricanes affect us most. But we had severe flooding inland, resulting in power outages, over 20 deaths, damages estimated to be more than $20 billion. John, this was a big story, and I think it showed the state's emergency preparedness in a fairly good light. Would you agree?
It did. Any large-scale enterprise like that is going to have problems, and North Carolina had some problems. But in general, the disaster response was very good. Governor McCrory, at that time, was in the midst of the home stretch of the campaign, spent a lot of time on the disaster relief. It probably gained him some additional support in the last few weeks of the race, and I think that that showcased North Carolina well to the rest of the nation, the disaster response.
And Brad, the legislature came into one of these special sessions and allocated a large sum of money, right. $200 million, to help with a large FEMA grant.
FEMA's allocated almost $300 million as a part of the lame duck session of Congress, last the 114th session. So almost $500 million going into counties and local governments. Tom, the big news still, you have families still displaced. So they're going to have to deal with getting housing situation for these families at risk.
Chris, a lot of people got kind of caught off guard by all of this flooding, even though they were being warned. What lessons do you think people should have learned from Hurricane Matthew?
Well, we should have learned it from Hurricane Floyd when 1999, some of the low-lying areas. I think another lesson is I think a lot of political leaders of both parties who traveled to these areas and saw where people were living, I hope the message is we need to do a better job helping people with better, safe, affordable housing before the hurricanes come. I mean, I think it really opened some people's eyes up when they went to areas that they had never been to.
And the wildfires were in the western part of the state.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that the special session that dealt with the hurricane and the flood and the forest fire recovery was only phase one. That was a big part of the discussion, was that even with the over $200 million that was allocated out of the savings reserve account, legislators wanted to be sure that as further assessments are done, that there's a commitment for more money to go to help those people with housing, shelter, small businesses, local government infrastructure.
After these messages, we're going to continue our rundown of the top stories.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
We don't have this, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
We continue our rundown of the top stories of 2016. Education is always in the news, and this year was no exception. We talked about our economic health earlier, but our medical health was also a big topic in this. Let's get to education first. Let me ask, Chris, what was the big story to you in education in this past year?
Well, I think there were a couple. One was the battle over funding, teacher pays. It was an election year. It dominated the news. I thought it was good that teachers got a raise. I still don't think they got enough, and all teachers still didn't get a raise. I think the other one is the sort of move away. John and Becki will call it choice. I would call it privatization of education in many ways. We dramatically increased the school voucher program. There are less regulations on charter schools. I think that's, and we continue to fund 2 virtual charters with spotty records. I think that's going to be the real big debate as we move forward. And I think it dominated this past year. One
of the things the legislature started this past year was achievement school districts to try to help these districts with low-performing schools. How's that shaping up, and what do you think of that effort?
One of the best things that the General Assembly did, Chris mentioned shoddy schools. This Achievement School District is a turnaround team that will go in and address 5 of, and we have over 50 failing schools in North Carolina, or maybe even more than that.
A lot of applications for it.
Yes, exactly. This is a turnaround team. This is the superhero education bill, and I think it's the best thing, one of the best things the General Assembly did.
And Brad, yet with all that's been going on with education, our graduation rate improved this past year. Test scores, however, particularly some of the national indicators, did not show great gains for our students.
No, but I think it's a pretty steady increase, Tom. I'll say this too, the election of Trump, I think you're going to see even more transformation and more change on education. You're going to see the federal government equalize the playing field for charter schools, and that's going to force our public schools to really decide what they want to be.
John, one of the big stories was the UNC system.
Yes.
We had a brand new UNC president, Margaret Spellings, who came in and took over. Legislature established with several of our UNC system schools a cap of $500 per semester tuition. What was the big news in higher education?
I really think it was this first year under Margaret Spellings. This is a significant national player that came to North Carolina into a job that has been very challenging but also very important for the state. I think her initial relationships with North Carolinians have been very positive. She's made some smart decisions about personnel, and I think that the coming year will be fascinating.
Well, I want to move on to the topic of health care, because we did a lot of talking about health care during this past year. Particularly as it related to Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare. Brad, a lot of providers were pulling out of Obamacare, not just in North Carolina, but throughout the nation. We're left with one statewide provider to insure people.
Well, and that's one of the key things that President-elect Trump will have to address, Tom, is the risk corridor money to make sure that the insurance companies are covered for the sick people who have enrolled in the federal exchanges. But we're going to see astronomical change. What they will repeal, Congress will repeal the Affordable Care Act in the middle part of the month. They will have to reconstitute an insurance market.
All right, and we saw a lot of big price increases for those who are subscribing to the Affordable Care Act. You think we're going to see a drop-off as a result of that?
If they repeal Obamacare and replace it with something that is more affordable and makes health care more accessible, I think we're going to see great improvements in health care.
Big story in Medicaid, John, was the fact that for the second year in a row, Medicaid showed a surplus as far as the state budgeting was concerned.
Yes.
And in addition to that, we applied to the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services in Washington for managed care waivers, which were passed the year before. Big stories there. Medicaid being better run?
Well, the big story on the matters that you just mentioned is Trump's election. if Hillary Clinton had been elected, North Carolina's Medicaid waivers, the Medicaid program would look very different than it's going to look now. Medicaid expansion, of course, turns out to be a moot point.
And we did see some additional monies for mental health finally this past year.
We did, but we still have a lot of struggles there. We still don't have enough beds. We still don't have, I think, a system that's working for everybody. I think that'll continue to be a priority next year.
All right. We're going to name our NC Spin Tar Heel of the Year in just a moment, but I want to give a program note to our viewers in the Wilmington area. Beginning next Saturday, January 6th, NC Spin will air at a new time on WILM. Be sure to tune in NC Spin Saturdays at our new time of 8 a.m. Tar Heel of the Year, coming up next.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
It's a fact. Patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Each year we poll our panelists to nominate a person who should be the NC Spin Tar Heel of the Year. And we're going to begin to tell you who got nominated and finally who gets selected. John Hood, I'll start with your nomination.
Tom, since 1972, only 2 senators have been elected to more than one term or served more than one term. Jesse Helms and Richard Burr. He was reelected this year by a convincing majority. He's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I think he is the clear Tar Heel of the Year pick.
Brad Crone.
Well, I'm going broad, Tom. I'm not naming any person. I'm saying the people of North Carolina because they endured one heck of a political campaign cycle last year.
So we'll have to divide this dollar prize up 9 million ways. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
People of North Carolina. Becki.
I'm going to nominate Representative Leo Daughtry, who is retiring after many, many years of service in the General Assembly and has been a true statesman through good times, through bad times. He has served in the majority, the minority, and to me, he is the embodiment of what we want North Carolina state government to look like.
Chris, your nomination.
Well, I think you have to nominate Roy Cooper in what I think was almost a Republican wave election. He defeated an incumbent governor, which is the first time that's ever happened in North Carolina since governors could run for re-election. He's never lost an election. He's led the Democratic ballot many years. People always underestimate Roy Cooper, and in the end, he always comes out ahead. I think he'll be a transformative figure, the dominant figure in politics as he negotiates with this Republican General Assembly.
We also had nominations for Pat McCrory, the outgoing governor of North Carolina, for his handling of Hurricane Matthew and also for spearheading the Connect NC bonds, and Congressman Walter Jones for his willingness to stand up and speak out on so many issues in which he strongly believes. Well, so after that, we've put our heads together and we have decided that we're going to name as the NC Spin Tar Heel of the Year, Senator Richard Burr. Congratulations, Senator, and thank you for your service. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback and read our weekly column. Visit us at ncspin.com or catch us on NC Spin Facebook. And join us next week for more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.